This is a very difficult subject, and it's one that I've actually had an increasingly difficult time dealing with, and frankly, that's a good thing, because my oldest daughter, we live in the city of Boston, and she goes to public schools, and some of her best friends, frankly, are Muslims, and that's the truth. My kid's a little eccentric, and what happens, and what happened was that essentially she fell in with two Muslim friends of hers, and at one point there was some hostility towards one of the girls. They would spit on her jacket at recess, so my oldest daughter would put her jacket over the other girl's jacket to make sure that they were unable to spit on it. This was the type of thing she did. But at the same time, she's become increasingly aware about what has happened as a result of jihadism in the Middle East, and she's started to learn a lot more about Islam. She can't help it because she lives with me. And there are times when I think sometimes I over-challenge her, I give her too much information. And one of the things that she said to me, and particularly after the killing that took place in Orlando, 49 people were killed at a gay bar, I think that really kind of caught her attention, because I think she understood that violence was rooted in Islamic doctrine. I don't think there's really any way to deny that. And one of the things she says is that she's torn. She said, "Daddy, I'm having a tough time because I don't really want to talk about these things because I really don't want to damage my relationships with my Muslim friends." And I said, "That's a good thing." I said, "You're going to have to learn to live with that tension, and you're going to have to struggle with it, but at the same time, you're going to have to figure out a way to basically," and I didn't even, I should have said this, but you're going to have to figure out a way to speak the truth without really doing them harm, or speak the truth in love. And I guess at this point, that's what I hope I can do. And there are times when I have fallen short. And one of the things that I have learned, or at least tried to remember, is that, we all claim to be Abrahamic faith. And that actually has a normative claim to it. And one of those normative claims is that God stayed Abraham's hand. And I think that's one of the most important normative claims that we have to remember. And whether or not we are able to, enlist God's help in restraining the hand and the blade. He restrained the blade. That's what he did. And fortunately for Christianity, we're given a whole set of practices to actually figure out a way to restrain the blade of hate and fear in our own hearts. And hopefully that will be what happens in the future for, larger numbers of people of the Muslim faith. But a few years ago, I was organizing a conference call, and one of the reasons I want to kind of explain why I worked for a Jewish organization. For the longest time, basically, my co-workers at Camera said, "Dexter, you need to speak more about Christians in the Middle East." And I said, "Look, we got a lot of work to do." And at a certain point, no, they said, "You need to do it." We had 2 conferences about it. This is a movie that what is happening in the Middle East right now is a movie that the Jewish community has seen before. And a few years ago, I helped organize a conference call with a Coptic Christian from Egypt, who had become a successful heart surgeon here in the United States, but was very well versed about what was going on in Egypt after the Arab Spring. And it took place after a Coptic church in Alexandria was bombed, and it killed approximately 24 people during the opening hours of New Year's Day on 2011. And during his call, he's a Coptic rights activist. He spoke about the suffering that Copts are enduring in Egypt, and the failure of the government to protect their lives. This was under Mohammed Morsi, and it was a pretty frightening presentation. And after the conference call, one of the listeners, somebody who worked at a federation somewhere in the Midwest, asked the caller what his advice was for his friends who still lived in Egypt. Would you tell them to get out before it was too late? And there was a long pause, and I said, "Oh no." And he said, "Yeah, that would be my advice." And it was a hugely painful moment. You could just hear the gasps of the people from the Jewish federations and the JCRCs, the Jewish Community Relations Councils throughout the country, because it was exactly the type of dilemma that Jewish leaders, their families had struggled with in Europe during the first half of the 20th century, during the Holocaust. And here we are in the 21st century now, and several other people groups are struggling with the same questions that Jews in Europe contended with during the 1930s. Should they flee the land of their birth to avoid the impending violence, or should they try to stay put, hope for the best, and risk for destruction? And if they do decide to leave, where will they go and who will take them in? And the thing is in the years since, with the ouster of Mohammed Morsi, which was a good thing, things have stabilized somewhat in Egypt. Essentially, at one point there, just to give you a sense, there's about 80 to 90 million people who live in Egypt, and about 10% of the population of that country is Coptic Christians, and they are the indigenous inhabitants. The country was essentially overrun or invaded by Arabs, and they basically became the minority. The Coptic Christians became the minority. For a long time they weren't, even though the Arabs dominated the country. And what happened was that after the Arab Spring that took place in 2011, about 100,000 Coptic Christians left the country because of the terrible acts of violence against them. One of the things that we see in Egypt and in some of these other Arab dictatorships is essentially the dictators will set themselves up as if they're the last bastion between the destruction of these communities and the radical jihadists in the countries that they govern. Saddam Hussein did the same type of thing in Iraq, and Bashar al-Assad has done the same thing. The Assad regime did that in Syria as well. And so that was what was going on in Egypt, and there are some people who think that and I'm one of those people, that they use actually Islamist violence against Christians as kind of a tool of statecraft. And what happens is that they will allow some attacks to take place to demonstrate just how badly these dictatorships are needed. But what has happened is that essentially when Sisi took over after the ouster of Mohammed Morsi, one of the things that he did was he basically appeared at Mass, he went to churches, and did everything he could to basically alleviate, or some of the things he could do, to alleviate the fears. I don't know if you saw all of the attacks that took place on Christian properties, but essentially the churches were set on fire, Christians were beat up, Coptic Christian men were accused of having affairs with Muslim women, which was one of the primary allegations used to incite acts of violence. Sometimes the people who went into churches would look at the Bibles and the liturgy and say that this is black magic, and they accused the Coptic Christians of witchcraft. So I'm just going to give you a brief overview. Also in Iraq, what happened was that when Saddam Hussein was ousted in 2003 as a result of the American invasion, which was personally one of the policies that I supported. This was a few years before I worked at camera. I thought that was going to be a wonderful thing, but as it turned out, basically the American forces basically looked at Iraq through the lens of the Kurds, the Sunnis, and the Shia, and basically the Christian community, which was numbered about 1.5 million. They fell off the radar. And what happened was that essentially Christians became the low-cost, no-cost targets of violence by jihadists. And one of the things that they would do in order to demonstrate their hostility towards the American forces was to attack the Christian churches. And there was a terrible bombing on Halloween in 2010. And essentially that was kind of what really drew a lot of people's attention. And there was about 1.5 million Christians living in that country, and now there's basically less than 500,000. I've heard numbers as low as 300,000, and a lot of them fled to Syria, and then as the Syrian civil war unfolded, some of them went back into Iraq. And Syria essentially has become a terrible place for Christians as well, largely because of the civil war, and a lot of the jihadist groups that are fighting against the Assad regime, they are basically particularly hostile towards Christians as well. And there was an individual by the name of John Eibner in 2012 who basically said, and he works for Christian Solidarity International, and he issued a genocide warning that said, look, if this war gets much bigger, it lasts much longer, we are actually looking at the possibility of the destruction of the Christian populations in the Middle East. And the problem was that essentially his warning really didn't get much coverage at all. And largely because I think a lot of people simply don't care. And so I think one of the things that we have to do is we have to start looking at really the history, and we have to figure out why this is happening. And one of the things that I want to mention also is that in Iraq, Juliana Taimarazi, who is in Chicago, after the Americans invaded, she said that Christian families received threatening letters offering three options: to convert to Islam, pay the jizya, or a form of protection tax paid by non-Muslims to Muslims, or to leave their homes empty-handed. And as families started to receive these letters, terrorists began systematically abducting and killing Christian clergy. And there have been hundreds of Christians who have been kidnapped and murdered because of their Syrian ethnicity and Christian faith. These acts have driven approximately 1 million people out of their homes where their ancestors had lived for thousands of years. One of the things that we have to remember is that while the Muslim majority population and the extremists oftentimes regard Christianity as basically a tool of Western imperialism, the Christians are in fact the indigenous population. They were there first. They were in the region long before Islam existed. And what has happened is that the history has actually been flipped so that they are now perceived as some sort of Western outside influence on the lands that they were actually born in. Then we've also, and then with ISIS, when ISIS arose, which was basically largely a terrible catastrophe, they revoked the option of paying the jizya as an option, leaving Christians with a choice of simply converting or dying. And many Christians fled to Kurdistan in northern Iraq, and they were ethnically cleansed from their homes that they had been living in for centuries. And I think one of the horrifying aspects of all of this was that when the ISIS invaded Mosul, essentially they painted the Arabic letter N on people's homes. And I don't know if you've seen it, but in Arabic it's the word Nun. And what happened was that they said, these people are our targets, these are the people who are going to be victims of violence in the future. And it was a clear message to everyone that you need to distance yourselves from them. And Christians are not the only victims. ISIS has murdered Yazidis, another religious minority in Iraq. In August 2014, ISIS invaded the Yazidi homeland at the base of Mount Sinjar in Iraq. And the New York Times reported the following: survivors say that men and women were separated within the first hour of their capture. Adolescent boys were told to lift up their shirts, and if they had armpit hair, they were directed to join their older brothers and fathers. In village after village, the men and older boys were driven and marched to nearby fields, where they were forced to lie down in the dirt and sprayed with automatic fire. Older women were murdered and buried in mass graves, and now these graves are now being discovered, and the younger women and girls were driven to Mosul and held for a while, and then sold at auction as sex slaves. Thousands of Yazidis have been killed, forcibly converted, or driven from their homes in the past few years. And this really shouldn't come as a surprise, largely because in many respects, this is kind of a repeat of what we saw during the Armenian genocide. It took place between 1915 and 1922 and caused the deaths of 1.5 million Christians. And so I guess at this point, one of the things that I'd like to do is to ask people, how many people have actually heard the word dhimmi? Okay, that's pretty good. So we're talking about 30% of the population, the audience here. Now, what has happened is that essentially there are aspects of in a Muslim majority environment, religious minorities, particularly Christians or Jews, are set up as a low-cost, no-cost target for violence because of the dhimmi status that I talked about previously. Now, what I mean by that is that dhimmi is derived from the word dhimma. When Islam becomes in control of, or Muslim rulers take control of a territory, what they do is they offer a choice. Okay, if you're not killed in battle, they'll give you the opportunity to either convert or pay the jizya. In some instances, they probably will just kill you. Now the thing is that ultimately one of the things that they will say is that look, you are given that there's no compulsion in religion, and that's an earlier passage from Muhammad's career as it's recorded in the Quran. But what happens is that some of the more hostile, violent acts, such as the sword verse, which is from Surah 9:5, that says, "Slay the unbelievers," that came later in Muhammad's career. And what has happened is that there's a doctrine called abrogation, or nask in Arabic, that essentially tells people that they need to follow the later passages, the revelations that came to Muhammad later in his career. The more conciliatory passages came in the earlier part of his career. The more violent and supremacist passage came in the later part of his career. And so what happens is that in many instances, and that doesn't mean that every Muslim somehow interprets these scriptures this way, but in many instances, essentially, and in most instances right now, particularly with ISIS and these radical groups, they always lay a heavier emphasis on the later passages. The reality is that this Dhimma Pact basically required people to give up their human rights as we would understand them in the modern world. When it was first thrust on these minority communities, when Islam was first founded and started to spread throughout the Middle East, it was actually kind of an improvement because in some instances these people groups would be ultimately completely slaughtered. And one of the things that we saw during the Middle Ages was that as a result of this Dhimma Pact, Jews could actually live in relative safety compared to what they were enduring in Europe. When they got expelled from Spain, a lot of them went to the Middle East, and that was because it was safer for them, because there was an institution that allowed for their protection. But the thing is that sometimes you could call this Dhimma Pact a treaty of protection, but it was also a treaty of liability. And Anglican scholar Mark Dury, who is somebody that you should probably get to know, one of the things that he spoke about is that when you paid the jizya tax, they would have a ritual in which you would be hit around your neck or head with a sword or a stick, basically to remind you that you were paying for the right to keep your head on your shoulders. All of the restrictions that were associated with the Dhimma Pact, and there was a whole long list of them that depended on where they were being spoken, they changed from one region to another and from one historical era to another, but they were all intended to humiliate non-Muslims in a Muslim-majority environment. And what that did was that it, first of all, basically kind of diminished the psychology of these dhimmi communities, and it also basically encouraged Muslims to view themselves as a superior people. Christianity was reviewed as a slave religion. These rules included you couldn't rebuild your churches or for example, even in Egypt, it's very difficult to rebuild a church after it's been destroyed. Now, one of the things that after the destruction of some of the churches in the Arab Spring, some of these churches have actually been rebuilt by the Egyptian army. But oftentimes, if you wanted to, one of the things that they could do to start a riot against the Christian community was to basically accuse the Christian population of worshiping in a building that they did not have the right to worship in. They were not allowed to build churches, so oftentimes they would build community centers. And then the nearby Muslim community would say, that's not a community center, you're praying and worshiping in that church, and that would be enough to start a riot. Other rules, and these I've heard direct testimony from Coptic Christians, you weren't allowed to ring the church bells because it was something that would offend the sensibilities of nearby Muslims who didn't want to have to listen to your singing. They didn't want to have to listen to your church bells. So one of the things that the Coptic Christians in Egypt did was they learned how to make a rattler so that you could actually, you would rattle and summon the faithful that way. We need to understand that every one of these rules was basically meant to constrain the social space that Christians could live in. And when you constrain the social space of a people, what you do is you make them a legitimate target for violence should the social order break down, which is exactly what happened here. One of the most dangerous aspects of this Dhimma Pact was that if you started to agitate for your rights, freedom, and equality, what would happen is that would mean that you abrogated the pact and you made yourself a legitimate target for violence or jihad. That was one of the roots of the Armenian genocide. During the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in the late 1800s, early 1900s, oftentimes the European countries would agitate and engage in politics on behalf of the Christians living in the Anatolian Peninsula. And that wasn't just the Armenians, but we're talking about Greeks, and to a lesser extent the Assyrians. The Greeks and the Armenians were mostly, they were more visible to the European powers. And what happened was that when the Western powers basically started to get the Ottoman Empire to capitulate on some of these rules, and that was the word that they used, the capitulations, that engendered an enormous amount of hostility towards Christians on the part of the average Muslim population, because they may not have had very much to look for. But the one thing that they did have was that that they were socially superior to the Christians in the community. So there were some riots against the Christians in the 1870s and the 1890s, and then when the Young Turks took over what was left of the Ottoman Empire to make the modern state of Turkey, one of the things that they did was that they used the language of jihad and used the rules that were associated with the Dimma Pact to portray the Armenian Christians as a legitimate target for violence. Now, the Young Turks are historically described as a people that wanted to make the modern state or a modern state of Turkey, but they regarded the Armenian Christians as basically a group of people that would not be trusted or governable in this new country. So what happened was that they reached back into their history and they used Islamic doctrine and practices to basically encourage terrible acts of violence against the Armenians. And if you look at the Armenian genocide, it's very similar to what has happened to Christians in Syria and Iraq today. The men were separated and murdered, and the women were basically either, depending on their age, they might have been murdered too, but if they were young enough, they were basically sold into sexual slavery or given to families as basically a child. And interestingly enough, oftentimes the property, these Christians were regarded as having inherited the property of their Christian parents who had been murdered, and that property then went over to the families that basically adopted them and took them in. And what happened was that many Armenians were lost to Christianity forever. And so I think one of the things that really is very bothersome is the manner in which we don't know this history, even though it has proven so decisive. The reason why we're talking about this at a conference related to Israel, in part, is because Israel was a dhimmi population of Jews, that was allowed to basically get out from under this system of Islamic supremacism. And that was a great source of humiliation for the Arab and Muslim world in the Middle East. And that's one of the reasons why we see such a level of animosity towards Israel, because that simply was not supposed to happen. In the Islamic nomos, or sense of order, or cosmos, essentially Muslims are supposed to be superior to non-Muslims. They're supposed to have the authority and they're supposed to have the power. And the notion of a free Jewish sovereign state is simply a shock, and it's a disconfirmation of what people in many Muslims want to believe about themselves. And it's a source of humiliation. And so, one of the things that we have to understand is that we are dealing with forces of history that have been around for a long time, and we have to remember that in many respects, Christian history is actually similar in its attitudes towards the Jews that Islam had towards Christians and Jews, Because one of the things that we have to understand is that many Christians had a very difficult time accepting the fact that the Jewish people continued to exist even after Jesus' resurrection. And his own people refused him not. And whenever they looked at the Jewish people, they saw something that disconfirmed some of their most cherished beliefs about Jesus and about the legitimacy of the Christian faith. This is part of what Muslims, I think, are struggling with, is that when they look at Jews and when they look at Christians, particularly the Christian West, which is less Christian than it used to be, and they see the success that we have, enjoyed, it's not supposed to be that way. It's supposed to be flipped. And so I think this is one of the things that we're going to have to struggle with over the long haul. Now, the thing is that I think we have been told an awful lot of things about Islam that simply are not entirely true. For example, they'll tell us that the Quran encourages, peaceful attitudes towards non-Muslims. Well, as I said before, that's not necessarily true. There are some passages that do actually that can be used to justify and encourage and promote good interfaith relations. And then there are other passages that can promote basically an attitude of supremacism over non-Muslims. And it's ultimately a decision that's going to be made by the Muslim community themselves over how they are actually going to interpret that scripture. And this is a very difficult thing, and I don't think that it's going to be a problem that we're going to be able to fix overnight. But whenever you hear people talking about Sharia law, that's what they're talking about. And so essentially, and this is a very troublesome thing. If people talk to you about Sharia law, there's three things that you need to know about it. First of all, it enshrines Muslim supremacism over non-Muslims. It enshrines the dominance of males over females, and it also codifies slavery. And historically, and more recently, people say, well, those rules really no longer apply. Well, the folks from ISIS disagree. And so this is one of the things that I think that we are going to have to basically struggle with, is there a way for us to talk about these problems that I've mentioned without inflaming the passions on the other side unnecessarily? And I think that's a really important goal, and I think that's one of the things that we have to understand, is that that's going to be our goal. Can we speak the truth in love in such a way that allows us to actually be heard? And I guess at this point, the one thing that we're going to have to say is that if Muslims are going to live in peace in a multi-religious world, they're going to have to go through a similar process to what Christianity has gone through in the years after the Holocaust. And it's going to be a very, very difficult process, since it's going to require an interrogation of Muhammad, whom Islam reveres as the example that all humanity should follow. And I want to, one of the things that I want to talk about is that Islam, maybe in the breakout session, is that Islam and Christianity and Judaism, or the Judeo-Christian ethic, offers up a fundamentally different worldview and a different response to the human condition. Jesus and Muhammad offer up a fundamentally different response to the human condition, okay? And offer a different model for leadership as well, okay? Because neither Moses nor Jesus got what they asked for. Jesus asked for this cup to be passed from him, and he went to the cross, okay? And Moses didn't get to go into the promised land, whereas Muhammad pretty much got most of what he ever asked for. Okay? And that's a fundamentally different, that's not a sacrificial model of leadership. And that's something that we really need to actually hold to in the course of, just being Americans. We have to remember, because it was that sacrificial model of leadership that has given us everything. But it's a difficult discussion. But talking about Muslim history without talking about the dhimmi stuff that I just mentioned before, without talking about dhimmitude and its impact on people's lives today, is like trying to talk about medieval Europe without talking about Christian anti-Semitism, or the United States without talking about slavery in the Old South, or the terrible things that we did to Native Americans here in the United States. And oftentimes we are encouraged to stay quiet about the threat that Islamic supremacism presents to human rights and world peace, because to speak about such things would hinder efforts at dialogue and reconciliation and promote hostility towards Muslims. And these concerns have some legitimacy. We need to figure out a way to speak about these issues without inciting hostility towards our neighbors, but the fact remains a great injustice is being done to minorities in the Middle East, and we need to speak honestly and forthright about it. And I want to quote a woman by the name of Bat Yor, who is an expert on dhimmitude. And she said that the aim is not to foster anti-Muslim or anti-Islamic feelings, but to create peace and reconciliation between religions and peoples, which the next century, and she wrote this in 1997, will become a bloodbath and a clash of civilizations. And so the upshot is that essentially Muslim practice and doctrine regarding non-Muslims represents the greatest threat to world peace and human rights in the 21st century. And this is a truth that needs to be repeated again, again, and again. Thank you very much.